Okay, I'm Andrew Stuck. I'm one of the co-directors of Walk, Listen, Create. We're not-for-profit. We support artists, performers, and writers who make work on foot or about walking or to be experienced on foot. So there's a sort of myriad of different types of walking and walking experiences. We run an annual poetry and flash writing competition for which the winners receive the accolade of becoming our writers in residence, of which I'm delighted to say Shani Cadwallender and Amelia Hodsdon are our writers in residence this year. And it was their idea to create a set of events called Finding a Place, Creative Critical Wanderings in the Landscape, of which this is one. And they chose their guests, and our guest today is Anna Burton. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to disappear very quickly off the screen and leave you in the hands of Shani and Amelia. But first, I'm just going to read their bios. So let's get to it. So Shani is a poet, teacher, and PhD researcher at Birkbeck. By the way, her PhD supervisor is in the room. At Birkbeck, University of London, whose interests are in trees, identity, and eco-poetics. And that kind of suddenly reminds me that I should be saying this is part of the Urban Tree Festival. So welcome anyone who's come via the Urban Tree Festival. Now, next up is Amelia Hodsdon. Amelia works with words for a living, to learn and for fun. She walks in the gaps. Originally from Cheltenham, she recently moved back after 25 years in London and is relearning the local landscape. Words for a living, editing and proofreading, formerly for The Guardian, Words to Learn, a student on Bath Spa, Nature and Travel Writing MA course from 2021 to 23, and Words for Fun, prose and poetry with a strong sense of place and a touch of the eerie. So I'm going to hand over the two of them. First up, I believe it's Shani, and then I'm just going to disappear into the background. So welcome, Shani. Thanks very much for taking over.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks for all of the logistical organisation of this evening. Thanks everyone for coming. Welcome to Finding a Place, which, as Andrew says, Amelia and I have organised as part of our online writers residency, and we're extremely lucky this evening to have with us a tree expert / legend, Dr Anna Burton. So Anna is a lecturer in English literature at the University of Derby. Her research is concerned with representations of trees and woodland in 19th century literature and culture, which is just my area too, as it happens. Her book, Trees in 19th Century Fiction, the Silvicultural Novel, was published in 2021, and her current project focuses on the literary and cultural history of tree planting in the Lake District. She also co-leads the Romantic Trees, the Literary Arboretum 1740 to 1840 project, and the Interdisciplinary Tree Talks seminar series. And I can say that I've been to some tree talks, and I'm reading Anna's book right now, and they're both very good. So just a little plug for her. Anna, whenever you're ready, please share your talk with us.
Thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you for everyone for coming along this evening, and to Shani, Amelia and Andrew for inviting me in the first place. I'll just share my slides and then I'll get started. Can everyone see my slides? Hear me okay? Yeah? Brilliant. Okay, so let's make a start then. So, the materiality and location of trees, and by that I mean their physical appearance and placement, play an active role in how these beings are perceived within the cultural imagination. The physical circumstance of a tree can both shape place and is also shaped by that place in turn. And it's necessary to understand how we perceive and attach meaning to trees in different environments. By that I mean their shape, situation, and characteristics, for instance, because it informs our ongoing perceptions and treatment of them and the environment more widely. And building on this central idea that connects our ideas about trees to the places where they grow. My current research focuses on literary and cultural responses to the placement, setting, and the placement, planting, and cultivation of trees within the English Lake District, and respectively how cultural and environmental ideas about this particular region have also shaped attitudes towards the caretaking of trees in this landscape. Now, in order to explore this central idea, I'm currently looking at how Lakeland authors of the past and present, from William Wordsworth and Beatrix Potter right up to James Rebanks and Lee Schofield today, respond to trees and tree planting in Cumbria. And in this talk, I'm going to give you a kind of brief insight into some of the research I've already undertaken for this project. In particular, I'm going to give you a bit of a snapshot of my work on William Wordsworth and climbing trees. Now, for William Wordsworth, Lakeland trees were shaped by a particular set of natural and cultural forces. In his guide through the lakes, there are extended passages devoted to detailing the treescapes of these environs. He passes comments about the kinds of species that are native and non-native to this region, found in gardens and on the fells, and generally waxes lyrical about how trees contribute to the character of the region more widely. In particular, Wordsworth took issue with what trees were being planted in the region and to what purposes. In the guide, he notes that certain trees have been introduced within these last 50 years, such as beeches, larches, limes, etc., and plantations of firs, seldom with advantage and often with great injury to the appearance of the country. So the author then goes on to isolate the larch tree in particular and to criticise those who plant it, not merely with a view to profit, but in many instances for the sake of ornament. So he's sort of incredulous that such vegetable manufactory, as he terms it, is planted for the economic gains of its timber. Also the fact that it's valued for aesthetic appreciation too. Nor is this spiky tree any better in a grouping for Wordsworth, as it causes nothing but deformity collectively. And whilst he's fully aware that the historical felling and enclosing of trees has altered the woodscapes of the Lake District at the time he's writing, it's the artificial introduction of the larch, a non-native species, that goes against the grain of working with the land for Wordsworth. Now, Wordsworth saw the larch as a somewhat unnecessary substitution for native broadleaf species. However, through correspondence and consultations regarding the land and woodland purchases of John Marshall, a wealthy family acquaintance, Wordsworth developed his perspectives on larch cultivation. And after viewing the Duke of Athol's extensive planting in Scotland, Marshall wrote the following to Wordsworth. The larch thrives in all dry situations and thrives most in high exposed ones, even amongst the rocks where there is little or no soil and where scarcely any other tree will grow. In low situations and deep soils, the larch grows fast, but produces timber of little value, it being nearly all sap. On the mountains, it grows more slowly, but it is nearly all heart and is valuable timber. On their accounts, the Duke of Athol now plants all his high mountain grounds with larch, but plants none of these in the low grounds where other trees will thrive. So larches are somewhat hardy trees that prosper where the soil is poorer. Consequently, like the Duke of Athol, Marshall here advocates the planting of trees at higher altitudes. And whilst they might have been rather grudgingly accepted, such notions did influence Wordsworth, as is evidenced in a letter by his sister Dorothy, wherein she writes to Marshall's wife, Jane, that my brother has made great use of Mr. Marshall's observations on planting. He recommends to everybody to plant larches on their high rocky grounds and oak and ash on their richer and low grounds. Equally, in Wordsworth's guide, there's an echo of this, as he entreats that native deciduous trees may be left in complete possession of the lower ground, and that plantations of larch, if introduced at all, may be confined to the highest and most barren tracts. For Wordsworth, as long as broadleaf trees retain custody of the lower ground, the larch can appear to hold advantage at elevated sites. And these observations also reveal that for Wordsworth and his contemporaries, the higher and lower places on Lakeland fells were viewed against different aesthetic standards and cultural associations. In Wordsworth's guide, the author suggests that the larch changes its visual character on higher ground. The winds would take hold of the trees and imprint upon their shapes a wildness congenial to their situation. So the location of the tree, whether planted or self-seeded, is integral to Wordsworth's assessments. It is the wildness of the climate at a high altitude that would shape the larch into a more agreeable form. In this sense, the tree becomes a product of this environment and equally reinforces that non-human wildness to the spectator. And this reciprocal dynamic between tree and place is evoked by Owen Jones and Paul Cloke in their discussions of what they refer to as arboricultural materiality. They say, because trees generally grow slowly in relation to humans and other beings, and because of their size, nature, and form, certain conditions of a place can become materially articulated in the form of the tree. Thus, they represent places in other ways. The body of the tree both embodies and contains a cartographic record of certain aspects of a place and represents these in a visible form which contributes to place milieu. So, in these terms, then, trees become an embodied reminder of place and climate, and the corporeal form of the tree is at once part of and a visual record for the topography in which it's situated. So, trees articulate place, and equally this position shapes the manifestation of their physical expression. In such circumstances, the larch is no longer a product of vegetable manufactory. For Wordsworth, the higher limits of the fells subsume and form the larch into a cartographic record of its upland environs. And it's not just the larch, but a number of species that might become an expression of altitudinal materiality for Wordsworth in his writings more broadly. For the poet, trees gain a different character and set of associations on higher ground. Similarly to his descriptions of the wind-formed larch, Wordsworth writes that from low and sheltered places, vegetation travels upwards to the more exposed, and the young plants are protected and to a certain degree fashioned by those that have preceded them. The continuous mass of foliage which would be thus produced is broken by rocks or by glades or open places, where the browsing of animals has prevented the growth of wood. As vegetation ascends, the winds begin also to bear their part in moulding the forms of the trees. But thus mutually protected, trees, though not of the hardiest kind, are enabled to climb high up the mountains. Gradually, however, by the quality of the ground and by increasing exposure, a stop is put to their ascent. Hardy trees only are left. Now, a climber in vegetal terms is a plant which climbs or creeps upwards by attaching itself to some support. And here, Wordsworth also refers to vegetation that travels upwards and ascends in this environment. Place-bound association transforms the tree that can climb high up the mountains into a mountaineering entity as much as a botanical one. And while such trees are described as hardy, they also gain a kind of exceptional ecological identity for the author. These bold specimens defy the odds of the climate and thrive on mountainsides and tops. Now, a few pages later, Wordsworth also refers to trees climbing up to the horizon and in some places descending from its sharp edge in which they are rooted, with the whole body of the tree appearing to stand in the clear sky. So the physical framing of such trees is an attempt to understand their seemingly miraculous and precarious existence. Ridge-grown trees also populate lakeland places in Wordsworth's earlier poetry. Depictions of outlying specimens figure as anthropomorphic renderings and or as imaginative landmarks for the speaker in question. And through these arboreal expressions, Wordsworth explores the articulation of elevated place in the Lake District. In The Oak and the Broom, for instance, the shepherd recalls crag a lofty stone on Nabscar, and out of its head an oak had grown, a broom out of its feet. From there, the tree and the shrub share a vegetal exchange. the oak tells the broom that rocks have recently dislodged themselves from above and conjectures that heaven knows how soon the broom will perish in these circumstances. Now, of course, the irony of the tale's conclusion is that after this dialogue, it's actually the oak, not the broom, that is dislodged and whirled far away from the crag in a storm. Through a somewhat straightforward and therefore actually quite rare for Wordsworth instance of arboreal anthropomorphism, the shepherd's story functions as a parable of prideful behaviour for the children at his knee listening to the tale. Nevertheless, in content, the poem is an early example that highlights Wordsworth's meditations on the harsh climes of the fells. And in The Haunted Tree, Wordsworth refers to a time-dismantled oak tree on a ridge at the top of Rydal Park. The tree is not given a voice, but makes a creaking sound in the wind, which has been identified by locals to be a hamadryad, pent within, or a troubled ghost which haunts the old trunk. However, the speaker states that no wind sweeps now along this elevated ridge, and so the tree is mute, and in his silence would look down his coevals in the sheltered vale below. So the oak's contemporaries do not look up, but instead view their own fast-stretching arms and leafy heads vividly pictured in some glassy pool. The Oak and the Broom, that previous poem, doesn't privilege the physical elevation of the oak over the broom in moral terms. In fact, it's quite the opposite. But here in The Haunted Tree, the stance and placement of the lowland trees enables their vanity, whilst it's the ridge-grown existence of the windswept oak offers a more positive example of arboreal existence. And the most revealing example of an elevated tree in Wordsworth's poetic output exists in Book 11 of the Prelude. Wordsworth remembers being a young boy waiting to be picked up for the Christmas holidays and repairing up to the highest summit on the crag where he waited the coach that was to take him home. The poet recalls that I sat half sheltered by a naked wall. On my right hand was a single sheep, a whistling hawthorn on my left, and there, with those companions at my side, I watched the valley below. So the wall, the sheep, and the tree become associated companions for the young Wordsworth in this moment. Like the haunted tree, the hawthorn is an exposed specimen characterized by the fact that it whistles in the wind like an arboreal rather than Aeolian harp. However, this particular scene is not an example of arboreal anthropomorphism. Instead, in this moment, the tree is formed into a kind of psychogeographical entity within the poet's imagination. So as Wordsworth continues to recollect that after his father's death in the Christmas holidays, it was this particular place and time, these spectacles and sounds to which I would often repair. In his mind, Wordsworth returns to this scene in which a version of his past self can be recovered. The elevated hawthorn in the Prelude is an upland landmark that's connected to and indicative of Wordsworth's own self and intimate experiences. And these climbing trees in the guide and the poetry help to shape the wildness of the situation for the spectator. But the characterization of them as relatable and alien entities is also a way of forging and expressing a kind of human and non-human kinship with that same place. Now, through such chameleonic expressions, it's fair to say that at a higher elevation, trees transcend the same cultural associations and socio-political limitations that trees and tree places further down into the valley are subject to. The conceptualization of the climbing tree then becomes a unique way of comprehending that specific terrain and cultural perceptions of trees more widely. Elevated trees in themselves are not just a visual boundary at which wildness makes itself manifest, but the climbing tree becomes a corporeal configuration of a wildness that surpasses human control and cultivation. Nature, in all senses of the word, does not just find a way here, it's moulded by the climatological and geological formation of the fells. And I think I will leave that there and hand over to Shani and Amelia. Thank you.
Yay! Thanks so much, Anna. That was super interesting. I forgot to say before Anna began that if you have questions, I've put it in the chat as well. You can put them into the chat so that you don't forget them, or you can keep them till the end and say them in your own voice. Or if you're not brave enough, you can ask one of us to ask them for you. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anna, for that amazing presentation. Absolutely love that. Now I'm going to try and remember how to share my screen. Haven't really done this since teaching during lockdown. So fingers crossed this will work. Again, yeah, I'm Shani. I'm a PhD student at Birkbeck, as Andrew said, and I'm working on a creative critical project about 3 minor women poets of the 19th century and their poetry about trees, and how the representative strategies that they use in that poetry relates to their marginalized positions in society. So I'm doing a bit of traditional research and a bit of composing my own poetry, and hoping in so doing to bring 19th century poetry, nature poetry, into dialogue with contemporary ecopoetics. So if you like the sound of that, then my socials, such as they are on the first slide here. And the reason we organised this event, as Andrew has said, is because Amelia and I won the creative writing competition for Walk, Listen, Create. And here's me looking smug with the with my winning poem in a frame. It's called Stump Speech. And fittingly for tonight's talk, it is also about Wordsworth and his relationship to nature and ideas about ease and ownership in nature. You can read this poem and Amelia's piece on the Walk, Listen, Create website if you're interested. So Anna was kind enough to give us a creative prompt to inspire our creative writing tonight. And it's related to what she's just been talking about from the guide to the lakes. So there were 2 extracts. Firstly, as vegetation ascends, the winds begin also to bear their part in moulding the forms of the trees, but thus mutually protected, trees, though not of the hardiest kind, are enabled to climb high up the mountains. And secondly, trees climbing up to the horizon, and in some places ascending from its sharp edge in which they are rooted, with the whole body of the tree appearing to stand in the clear sky. So I was struck by several things in these 2 quotations, but in the first quotation, I actually went and looked at the guide and read it in its wider context. And as Anna has discussed already, this section forms part of a complaint about the artificial planting of what Wordsworth considered spiky, excessively spiky larch trees. And according to the guide, this planting ruins what he calls, quote, the sympathy and organization of a natural wood, in which seeds fall at random, and the resulting tree either taking its own shape without constraint, or more often having to, quote, conform itself to its neighbours. So this natural planting in Wordsworth's view is not only aesthetically superior, but as we can see in that first extract, it supports the less hardy trees to grow where they might not otherwise survive. So he sort of sees natural woodland as morally superior in that regard too. And more recent arboricultural study, such as Peter Woolburn's book, The Hidden Life of Trees, has actually proven Wordsworth right in this regard. So Woolburn argues that trees actually do work together in natural woodlands to help the needy trees survive. And he argues that plantations of the same species don't work as well. He calls them an evil, actually, because the trees are more isolated and prone to disease. So I was interested in the language of community and interdependence that Wordsworth uses to describe the natural woodland, as opposed to the artificial isolation of the planted trees, especially in our current moment of corporate greenwashing, where lots of companies are planting trees en masse to try and offset emissions. And the anthropomorphic description of the value of natural woodland, it doesn't just seem to offer a way of managing trees ethically, when he says that they're mutually protected, But also it made me think about what it might offer as a model for human communities. It kind of works as a bit of a reversible metaphor, advocating against homogeneity, which is focused on profit, and advocating for diversity, solidarity, and sharing of resources. That said, in the second extract on this slide, there seems to be a tension between that sympathy of natural woodland helping each other out and the aesthetic appeal of the lone tree, which is shaped by the wind and stands in the clear sky. So if the woodland is representative of an interwoven community, I was thinking about how the lone tree's aesthetic appeal might fit into that. And applying the metaphor to humans, how does individuality, or the appearance of it, actually rely on invisible structures of support? There's a tendency also in the guide to cherish native plants over exotic or foreign ones, which Anna's talk has elucidated for me. But I always find that imposition of human national boundaries on plants quite disturbing in some way. And I thought about the elevated trees as social outsiders as well, people in precarious positions, like the trees are literally. So in many ways, the opposite of the kind of moral elevation that Anna's talk was suggesting, and more of I interpreted them more as outsiders in one way or another from the woodlands kind of solidarity. So I started to think about several things, several likenings, if you like, between plants and humans. So I was thinking about how people who live in more populated and diverse places in Britain are less likely to be racist. Just like the trees, they adapt to their neighbours in sympathy. Wordsworth's trees are a bit like this burdock plant on the right-hand side of your slide that I saw in the park this morning. And they are shaped by and adapt to inhospitable environments, which I think is a metaphor for human adaptability and resilience. And I also thought about how people use categories, whether it's class, racial, or other categories like weed versus real plant, to dismiss the worth of each other with little knowledge of how working together might benefit them. And the plant on the left there is a thing called yarrow, which I didn't actually know anything about until a few days ago when I was sitting in Gordon Square and noticed it in the grass. And apparently some people classify this plant as an invasive weed that you should under no circumstances allow to grow in your lawn, while others use it for medicine and actively cultivate it because it brings nutrients up from the soil. That's not really to do with trees, but it sort of goes to the metaphor about mistaken categorization, I suppose, or complicated categorization. And it also seems like a perfect emblem for collaboration, for like types of plants working together when humans might consider them to belong in separate categories. So my poem, which I'll read to you now, is called Coevals, and its title comes from The Haunted Tree, which Anna's just been talking about. And it's exploring these ideas of community and resilience and difference by considering my own positionality as a working class writer and also as a person of colour, and thinking about precarious roots and how being an outsider interacts with collaboration and support to make hopefully successful growth. So this is Coevals. How to keep it up. Dirt-born, ascendant, pebble-dashed, unsteady roots. What slipshod footing, what right to snatch at shuddering such heights? Out on a limb, my last myelinated nerve, this close to fingers yarrowing of lawn. Is it you hold me, whip smart, angled sharp, allegedly aloft? Bear me like winds enabling shapely climb, or Is it me too? Hardly hardy, hardened so by blows, and in the clear, a standout yet. Thank you very much. I believe Amelia is going to share her piece with us, which will be a treat.
Thanks, Shani, and thank you so much for sharing all of your thinking about that. I love how you go very deep into these creative prompts, and then you go around and then you come back to a very unique place. I loved your poem, and I love the idea. I love how you've looked at the trees not as individuals, but they're there because of invisible support. And I love the parallels you draw with everything. So thanks very much for sharing that. And I look forward to rereading it again later. So it'd be great. We'll try and get it up on the website this time, which didn't manage to do last time. That was my fault. So thank you very much indeed. One quick question: myelinated. I didn't know that word. What was that?
Myelin is the like coating, the protective coating that covers nerves.
Ah, right. Thank you. Great, and thanks very much, Anna, for your talk. I've scribbled down all kinds of things. I loved time dismantled. That was a terrific phrase you pulled out. So I'll see if I can get that in somewhere. So from the same creative prompts, I think I kind of went off in my own head rather than doing research. I kind of thought about what popped into my head. And the first landscape that came to mind was the kind of stubbly hillsides of the Scottish lowlands. So as you're driving north or south on the M74, there's just forestry plantation after plantation. And it's such a strange landscape to me. And I always get very curious about how long it is from planting to the logging and the growth in between. And then the landscape that mostly seems to be there is this kind of desolate landscape with the stumps and then maybe the odd tree silhouetted against the sky, which kind of called back to part of the prompt you shared with us. And then I thought about the planting you see by roadsides, and the plastic tubes always seem so close together, but I guess someone knows what they're doing. And then I thought about a wood closer to my home in Gloucestershire and how protection can become constriction. So a couple of miles from my house, there's a patch of ancient woodland, or a PAW, a plantation on ancient woodland. And the ancient bits have been there since the 1600s, but in the 1960s, part of it was cut down and replaced with money-making cedar, spruce, and pine. And since 2015, it's been owned by a charitable trust who manage the wood for ecological and environmental reasons. And the public are allowed in if they keep to the paths and take away their dog poo. The wood is being visibly looked after with constant signs of change. Some areas have been cleared, breaking up the dense evergreen cover, and in other parts there has been replanting of broadleaf trees. I can imagine the burst of enthusiasm when the charity took over, investing in new trees to bring life and sound back to the hillside. Because the conifers are cold, silent, and dry, barely anything grows in the crepuscular light beneath their canopy. On the other side of the track I'm walking along is beech, birch, and hazel, full of birdsong, bluebells, and garlic, the scent warmed in the dappled light and stirred by the spring breeze that moves freely. You can see what it might all be one day, but maybe this mix is no bad thing in the meantime. Everything in moderation, and now that at least it's being looked after. At the top of a wood, near a spring that bubbles out between the roots of a beech tree, is a mouldering pile of discarded tree guards, the corrugated plastic gathering moss and slugs. The recommended useful lifespan for a tree guard is 7 to 10 years, and after that they should be removed and the tree left to fend for itself. As I walk down through the wood, I pass glades of young trees, still corseted in plastic. They seem to be suffering. Some of these trees have fallen, like someone rolled up in a carpet. Others bulge over the tops, their trunks distorted. Is someone planning to release them? I wonder about doing it myself. In the meantime, I do something else. I find an app set up by the Forest Plastics Working Group and, no pun intended, log them. We have to remember to remove our helping hands. And that's where I went to.
Oh, I love that. I really liked, we have to remember to remove our helping hands. That's super poetic, and also like totally so relevant, right? Like to everything we've been talking about tonight, like the idea of artificial planting and assisting nature, now that we've done so much to screw it up, but also like trying to then, how do you go about making sure that you remove the negative, potentially negative or damaging impact of that supposed help. Yeah,
and just let
cool.
them be.
Well, okay, that was great. Thanks everyone for your lovely input. Does anybody have a question that they would like to ask, either in person or in the chat? Anna, I wanted to ask you a question, which is, it seems like from your presentation, it seems like Wordsworth sort of changed his mind about larches. And like, is that what really happened? Like, or is it just in the poetic presentation of trees like larches, if they're high up, they get, they're sort of considered morally superior? Or like, is it just poetic, or did he change his mind about larches being planted? It just seems quite hard on larches.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Wordsworth was the only one who was so anti-larch, but I think it's very much part of this kind of what your poem kind of touched on, and when you in your sort of talk, rather, this kind of idea of eco-xenophobia, I think Andrew Herzucha called it, picks up on that language, that kind of unsettling idea of the kind of non-native species invading, and all the kind of problematic associations of that kind of language now, how we can sort of separate that. But I think ultimately, I think Wordsworth thought he really didn't like the larch. I think it was just in its best situation high up because it was molded, as I say, or as his words say, by the kind of climate, and it's shaped into a more appealing form. That being said, Wordsworth was very contrarian in kind of his own opinions. So, if you look at his gardens, the trees he planted, they are full of non-native species. Think of the kind of rhododendrons at Rydal Mount, or, the kind of variety of species that, he or we might deem as non-native. But in a garden setting, that's different. And then the kind of up on the fells, again, that's different again. So in what places? So there's not really a straightforward answer to that. I think he was just quite contrarian, liked being like that to some extent. He had his own set of rules, I think, that maybe slightly changed through his lifetime and through different perspectives. But he really didn't like it, but I think it just became more appealing, and a kind of, as I said in the talk, kind of an articulation of the fells themselves rather than as an important tree on its own.
It seems like there's a this is coming off more as a like statement than a question, but it seems like there's like a tension always between him wanting to control the landscape, like control to preserve, and like the idea of wildness, or the idea of things, native natural things. Elle, have you got a question? What a delight.
Yeah. So thank you very much, everyone. This has been such a fascinating and kind of rich way of thinking about trees, which are, I think, especially in urban environments, are sort of easily ignored. But so I wanted to ask, this is a bit, I guess this is slightly off piste, but I did the Hadrian's Wall walk in last year, almost a year ago. And it was probably about 3 weeks before the tree at Sycamore Gap was felled. So I saw it, but my feet hurt, and it was 17 miles into the day, and I did see it and thought, oh, it's a nice tree, I guess. And everyone was going, oh, it's so amazing, the Sycamore Gap tree. And I thought, yeah, it's a nice tree, but I didn't take it in as much as I think I would have done had I known that it was going to disappear very soon. And I think when it did come down, there was this great sort of national outpouring. There were a lot of emotions, personal emotions, but also what felt like kind of national emotions or regional emotions around the presence of this tree, and then its sort of very sudden, very violent absence. And I wanted to, I guess, ask about each of the speakers' kind of personal reactions to that experience, to that like moment, but also, yeah, actually, I didn't know that the two people charged with the felling were actually in court today. So I guess, yeah, your reactions to that would be fascinating, but also, I guess, what you think that might have to say about the way that we relate to trees in Britain in general. I'd love to know.
Yeah, I'll start if that's okay. I've just seen what Arthur's put in the chat, which is when trees leave the wood or their companions, they can spread and grow into characters, and we can frame them within the surrounding space. That's a pretty spot on reason, I think, why the sycamore gap tree was so the felling of it was so significant. And I think I found it to be fury making and very saddening to see that that had happened. And so it seemed like such needless, like wanton destruction, but more over like a sort of one tangible symbol of the ways that human beings are destroying their world more widely. I guess that's how it hit me, and I wonder if maybe the emotional outpouring is partly to do with, as Arthur says, that decontextualized. That when trees are decontextualized from woods, we can think of them as having characters. We can identify them with the space around them more than with other trees. But I also think perhaps some of that, the recognition of kind of human damage, might have been in the background of people's feelings. What did you think, Anna?
I think it's obviously a horrendous thing, but it is fascinating, and it's interesting that it's come up in this talk. I think I mean, in the 19th century, there were tree obituaries in the newspapers. So, like, if a tree was sort of had fallen down in Hyde Park or something, it would be in the news with a kind of picture of the felled tree. So there is a bit of a kind of culture of this anyway, of kind of memorializing individual trees that people are known as visiting. I think Sycamore Gap was a landmark, and people had, a variety of personal associations as much as we had national associations with it. People, visited it from being a child on holiday, as it even featured in like wedding photo shoots, that kind of thing. So I think people had a real kind of personal connection with it on an individual level, but also on a community level as well. And I think that, I mean, there was a lot of kind of think pieces around it, wasn't there? It's kind of, well, why are we just sort of interested in this one individual tree when there's, thousands of trees being destroyed in the Amazon every day? And I think, well, can't both of those things be true at once? Can't we be concerned for both of those things? Why does it have to be one or the other, as it were? But yeah, I think it's fascinating how it's kind of the kind of people's responses to that tree, and people went and left roses and things, like, as if it was like the scene of an accident, kind of thing. So just, yeah, fascinating really, and horrific in equal measure.
Yeah, I think it's the connection of that tree to yourself. This is something that Eleanor's just said as well, that a tree out of context can be a person. And I think you can look at a tree standing on its own, kind of imagine it as yourself, and also see how vulnerable it is because it can't move. You might at least be able to run away, but that tree couldn't go anywhere. And I think that was part of the sadness, that it really had no choice. It couldn't stand up. It wasn't a wolf or something else that could fight back. It was just busy being a tree, and someone did whatever they did. And Vanessa's, a couple of people have made the point about the single tree versus all the trees that's being cut down all the time. And it's true, they're maybe focusing on single trees at least gets people to think about their personal connections to a tree, and that will strengthen their connection to nature. And then we can think about all the individual trees that are in a forest, which is a bit harder. And I think that's why the swathe of forest is less of a news story than a single tree, but at least we're talking about it and making it news and opinion pieces and mourning a tree, because I don't think that would have happened, well, maybe in the 19th century, but certainly I don't think 20 years ago it would have been.
Yeah. I thought I was going to say something about this, but now I've got distracted by what Rory's put in the chat. It certainly got me thinking about how tree felling, oh no, I've lost it. is widely felt as an act of violence, but so dependent on context. Where I'm from in New Zealand, the felling of a European tree on, I can't say that, One Tree Hill, Maungakieke, One Tree Hill in the early 2000s was an explicitly decolonial act of protest, much like the felling of a flagpole. Anna's got something interesting in her book about trees being defiled on land, like British landowners' land in the 19th century, which sounds like a similar type of thing. Anna, will you say something about that? Because I'm going to mangle it.
No, it's fine. I was kind of building on an article by someone else whose name, forgive me, it escapes me, but it is, I'll try and find it. It's this idea of tree maiming. So this idea of kind of angry sort of peasants, lower class people, for want of a better word, who've been thrown off the land, wanted to in some way attack the landowner. And trees were a landowner's wealth. It was a symbol of their power. The amount of trees was therefore indicative of their monetary value, and therefore the amount of value that person had. So to attack a landowner's trees was a kind of socio-political act in that way, a kind of form of protest in terms of against a landowner. And there's kind of various forms in which that took, but it's also referred to as kind of tree maiming. But it's got kind of class and kind of social protest sort of connotations to it.
Yeah, it's interesting that a tree can both be can be that, a kind of an emblem of protest, like to fell a tree can be that, and a kind of decolonial statement or a statement of kind of class disaffection. But it could, like, the research I'm doing is about an Indian poet called Toru Dutt, who was writing in the 1860s and 70s, and she writes about a casuarina tree that she can see from her window in Calcutta, and she uses it as an emblem, like a reflection of herself and her limited freedoms as a woman in India at the time. So she kind of identifies with the tree and describes their subjection in the same terms. So it's interesting that it kind of works both ways. It can be like, well, we'll destroy your tree, landowner, because you've put this unnatural thing here. You're trying to control the landscape and us. And then, on the other hand, some people in positions of subjection are using trees to kind of explore and share something. And I think that was that I was trying to get at that, I guess, in my poem, the idea of like forests as representing community, and maybe I don't know, maybe being something to do with recognizing the connections between people and trees. David says, he's my supervisor, by the way, thanks Andrew for pointing that out. All of these points about the same tree versus the forest speak really nicely to Wordsworth's views on urban v rural life. His account of London in the Prelude is full of anxieties about the self being submerged and lost among so many others. Yeah, that's super interesting. And there's that, I'm going to mangle this as well, but there's a Wordsworth poem called something like The Reverie of Poor Susan, where he describes a thrush singing somewhere in Cheapside, and this poor girl imagines herself surrounded by woodland. So there's the kind of like the isolated examples of nature in the city, also kind of throwing you back into happier, more, I don't know, natural, self-defined time when you're less lost in the crowd. So yeah, I think that's rad. And Rory says, and then you've got the inverse historical context in Ireland of systemic deforestation in order to build the British Navy, where the felling is explicitly colonial. Yeah, good point. Trees do everything. Amelia, I feel like you need to say more, because I've been banging on for ages.
Oh, yeah, trees is your sweet spot. I was just thinking while you were talking about, again, about the identification of oneself with a lone tree, whether it's the sycamore gap tree or somewhere else. And near where I am, there's a tree up on the top of the hill, and it used to be a pair of trees, and now it's just one tree, and everyone calls it the lonely tree. I don't know if it is lonely, who knows? but there's now a memorial wall around it. So tens of people have chosen, of their families have chosen that spot as where to be remembered, and there's a bench that runs around by the memorials, and it becomes a real focal spot. And I think that kind of communion between one person and one tree and the one place that it's in becomes really important, and that can be extrapolated to a woodland. But I think humans do, you do form a relationship with a tree that you see often. Maybe it's somewhere you pass on the way to work, or it's by a bus stop, or wherever it is, and you watch it through its seasons, you watch it change colours, and maybe people carve things into it, or something happens to it. And you really, I think it's such a path for caring if you can identify with a tree in that way, and then you can turn that out to everything else. So thinking about the urban treeness, there aren't as many trees in London as there are not in London. But when you see a tree, it becomes more important because there's fewer of them, and you put more, it becomes more precious. So I imagine everyone here has got a tree in their lives that they see from time to time. Maybe they even have a little word with it or give it a pat. I don't know, but I think everyone, probably you've come here for this reason, you do have that connection with trees.
Yeah. I read Paul Wood's book, London is a Forest, said that there's about, you know, one tree per person in London now. So same number of trees as people. We could just each get one.
Yeah, each adopt one.
Yeah, and to your earlier point about the way that we care about all trees, big collections of them, and wider deforestation and felling is maybe one of the ways into that kind of care is more personal attention, because that's where empathy begins, right? And then we can try and widen the loop of that empathy.
I like that idea of adopting a tree, even if it's just metaphorically, to know that there's one out there for you.
I mean, the Wordsworth family actually planted a lot of trees for their family, for themselves. So I've kind of written about this elsewhere, but they planted trees and named them sort of after each other to some extent, either areas of trees. So there's Dorothy and William's brother, John, died. But before he died, he'd helped plant trees in their orchard at Dove Cottage. And when Dorothy finds out that he's passed away, she writes in a letter that the trees are now growing, which he planted there. That's one of the kind of key things that she sort of remembers. And it's like they have trees as a kind of familial link. And I think that sort of speaks to your point, Amelia, this idea that we have these kind of, it can be a memorial bond, or it can just be a kind of personal bond, but it's a kind of, I think because they are a living thing, when they are planted, we sort of think on some level they're kind of infused with a little bit of the planter, maybe almost, if we think about it somewhat spiritually in that sense, I suppose. And there's a nice kind of human vegetal link in that sense.
It's I guess it's sort of annoyingly more a comment than a question, but it does build off of stuff that you have been saying, especially the way that Amelia was describing trees as everyone sort of having one in their life that they sort of feel strongly about. It reminded me of the way that we talk about like charismatic megafauna, like whales almost. And then I imagine most people here have probably read The Overstory by Richard Powers, which is all about trees. And one of the things that really struck me in that novel was that he has a metaphor for them where he almost describes them as being like giant aliens. Like they live on a different time scale to us, but he really gets to the heart of them as organisms. And I thought that was really interesting. And perhaps, you know, if they, you know, if they had eyes, if they were like whales or polar bears, it would be easier to sort of harness the appeal that they have. And the other thing is that Anna's mentioning of Wordsworth's kind of family trees. I thought my parents planted 2 apple trees when my brother and I were born, and one was mine and one was his. And mine came down recently because it got some kind of infestation, and I felt really strongly about it. I don't live in America anymore, so I'm probably more reactionary than my brother is about things changing, you know, in the garden or in the house, because I'm like, no, that's home. It can't change. but it was the tree specifically that felt really personal, and it was like, oh, my tree's gone, you know. So that's obviously a real like impulse that people have, a real instinct to identify with these things that might outlast us, but then again might not. But yeah. Oh, I like what Vanessa's put in the chat.
And we were talking just before the talk began about baby schema, which is this thing about how things with big eyes are kind of appealing to whoever's looking at them, babies or small animals or whatnot. And I really like your point, Elle, that the trees can function kind of bigger than what they are in a totally different way, so that they become the standout in the way that a whale isn't particularly cute, really, but it stands out and it then stands for things beyond itself. I've forgotten everything I learned about this kind of language, so apologies for not having the right terminology, but it's something, yeah, I've totally lost that thread, but I'll try and work it out. Sorry.
Anne has put something in the chat, which I think is pretty cool. One thing that struck me in the Wordsworth quotes is that he focuses on the trees as moving beings, not just by conforming to the movement of the wind, but by ascending. He's on the edge of anthropomorphism, but I also felt an attempt at affinity here, and maybe a message too. Ascent is difficult, and the hardiest get to the top, human and arboreal. Yeah, and 100%. I totally saw that in it as well. And I thought, it gave me questions. I feel like I always feel conflicted about Wordsworth because I never quite know where he stands, as it were. Because some of what he's saying there is, you know, suggesting that woods help each other and helping each other is good. But some of it is also very kind of, I don't know, like masculinist sort of like vibes of you must dominate that mountaintop. And if you're not climbing to the top, then you're obviously not strong enough. And like there's a song by Joanna Sternberg where she says, all I can do is try not to cry on mountains high. And I think that's more my attitude to ascent, right? Like you just have to do your best not to be terrified when you're making a metaphorical ascent. Okay, well, are there any more questions or comments or from my lovely colleagues / panelists? Is there anything more?
No, just okay, thank you for your
Gemma,
responses.
Sorry, say again.
I was just saying thank you for your responses, that's all.
Oh, yeah, thanks everyone for your responses. Gemma's really enjoyed the session, which was the whole point, really. And thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to Amelia and to Anna and to Andrew.
And Anna, well done. You came along, you gave us a fantastic presentation, and what can I say? I've got these two fantastic writers in residence. They not only came up with the concept of this really good event, but they actually put their pens to paper and write some really good stuff. So I'm really proud of them, and thanks to everybody who's come along to support them. And I'm hoping that they've only done 2 of these. I'm hoping they might be tempted to keep going. But we shall see what happens in the near future. And in the meantime, everybody have fun and get out there, do some walking and go hug a tree.